All right, welcome to Conversations with Catholics. This is episode like 16 or 17 or something. I've lost track, but I'm very excited for this episode because I am joined by Catholic writer John Buck. John Buck has been on a bunch of other YouTube channels defending a cumulative case for theism. He's been interfacing with people like Emerson Green, as well as other Christians, people like Rebecca from the Bread of Life. John, I'm very excited to have you here. Would you like to say a word of introduction?
Yeah, no. So my Twitter handle is writer John Buck, but as of right now, I haven't actually written anything professionally. So it's mostly a sort of aspirational title that I've given myself. I do hope to write a book eventually, but as of right now, it's still aspirational. But yeah.
I actually quickly read through the paper that you wrote it, right? It was like a theodicy like a theodicy paper, right? It was on your Twitter. Yeah, I read. You're a writer.
It's not published though. It's not.
Who cares?
Whatever. I do write.
There you go.
But
yeah, you didn't say published writer John Buck, just writer John Buck.
That's true.
There you go. You set
technically correct.
You set the goal appropriately, and you achieved the goal. That's all there is to it. So
yeah, exactly.
I think today the plan was for us to start with nominalism and then kind of see where the conversation takes us, right? And just so that everybody in the audience knows, you and I discussed a little bit over email. John is Catholic, Catholic convert to be precise, if that matters. I don't think it does. And I, of course, am ex-Catholic. So nominalism is probably going to be one place where we disagree. And I think what I'll do, if it's all right with you, is I will kind of state why I'm a nominalist. And then maybe you just, you pick up some stuff in there that you want to respond to.
Yeah. And if you could detail or explain what nominalism is quickly too.
That's a very good plan. So nominalism is an idea that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense unless you also reference realism. So realism and nominalism are kind of like two sides of the coin. There's different types of realism. There's Platonic realism and moderate realism. For the sake of this conversation, I'm kind of just going to focus on the difference between realism and nominalism. Realism says that there are these things called universals. And these universals are useful because they allow for things like inference. So if you say all men are mortal, Aristotle is a man, therefore Aristotle is mortal. Men, in this instance, is a universal. It's a universal to which the particular Aristotle belongs, but Aristotle is not the only member of this universal man. Theoretically, John and I are both men as well, as long as we're both not like, lizard people or something like that. And so this inference is permitted through the universal of man. Well, the nominalist is somebody who says, I actually don't think that universals exist. So this is probably less controversial for some version of universals because man isn't the only universal. Something like love is a universal. And so it might not be as controversial to say, well, love doesn't exist. Technically, what does exist are the chemicals in your brain. Okay, fine, well enough. But there are some pretty controversial areas that a nominalist would entail. So nominalists would reject not just love, but also the fact that men per se exist, the universal of man. There's particular men, sure, but there's no mankind. There's no universal of man. There's also no numbers, which is pretty uncomfortable for a lot of nominalists. Among other things, any kind of universal, the nominalist is going to reject. So I just laid out why all of these, nominalism can be kind of, a little uncomfortable. So why am I a nominalist? Well, I'm convinced by the argument from causal inertness. The argument from causal inertness pretty much just says, hey, universals, everybody admits, realists and nominalists alike, are causally inert. If something is truly causally inert, then it's 100% unfalsifiable. And then an application of Occam's razor, William of Ockham being the original nominalist, pretty much just says, hey, let's not multiply things into our ontology unnecessarily. If there is something that is entirely causally inert, it's entirely unfalsifiable, it seems like we can explain the whole universe without referencing these things, then let's just plain old not posit them into our ontology. So I don't. It's a little, I've described it in the past as being like anticlimactic, the reason for which I'm a nominalist, because it really is just like an appeal to Occam's razor, which is kind of anticlimactic. But It's almost like a lack theism definition of atheism. So a lot of people get all up in arms about atheist versus agnostic versus lack theist. Nominalism is almost like a lack realism, if you want to talk about it that way. But unlike the whole atheism lack theism debate, like that is like the if you take a look at the literature on nominalism, it is defined as essentially lack realism. So that's the main reason why I am a nominalist. And sure, some of it's uncomfortable, but I kind of just have to revel in the uncomfortableness of nominalism. So that's like a brief sketch.
Yeah. Okay, so I've got a couple ideas of like where to go. I guess like let's first sort of hone in a little bit on this sort of like Occam's razor understanding that we should only postulate that which is required, or like we should prefer simpler explanations over those of more complex ones. And I guess the question is like, is there going to be a sense in which that's still going to require almost some sort of realism, or maybe some sort of truth, a facticity of numbers as well, like to say that one theoretic system has 5 things in it while another has 4 things in it, we should prefer the one with 4 things. But are we going to be thereby committing ourselves to the number 4 as a descriptor of how many things there are in the world?
Yeah, so I guess what you're saying is like, is it possible to quantify what is simpler if we don't have this realist concept of numbers?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that we
Yeah, so
can.
sort of like the indispensability argument that might have been presented by somebody like Quine for
Okay.
the use of numbers. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that we can talk about simplicity um, without having a realist conception of numbers, because we can have a fictionalist conception of numbers. And I guess just very briefly, fictionalism, sometimes referred to as speaking with the vulgar in the literature. Vulgar meaning the common people, not vulgar as in like a curse word or something. And fictionalism is just saying we can speak as if it's true, but it doesn't actually have to be true for us to use it as if it's useful.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that we need a realist. I don't think that we need to be realists about numbers to compare different things and see which one requires fewer commitments. And sometimes what I think about is like in engineering, we'll often talk about how units are indispensable.
Mm-hmm.
In mathematics, there's kind of no units, but in engineering, units are indispensable. And so what the nominalist is doing is the nominalist here is the engineer and the realist is the mathematician,
Mm-hmm.
where the nominalist is saying, well, we don't actually have to like look at the actual number in a realist sense. We have to look at the units and then just say, using like a fictionless connotation of numbers, which one has fewer units, but the units themselves are real.
Gotcha. Would you consider yourself a scientific realist?
I'm not sure if I understand what a scientific realist would entail. So what does that mean?
Yeah, so like somebody who thinks that the theoretical posits that certain successful scientific theories sort of present are ontologically committal. So like if our best science sort of tells us that there are such things as quarks or electrons that exist, then me being a scientific realist, that would mean that I'm committed to the existence of these things called quarks and electrons that have the properties that science ascribes to them.
So I think that what I'm committed to is some kind, like I don't think it's turtles all the way down. So I think I'm committed to some kind of like most mereologically simple entity. Now, if our science tells us today that the most mereologically simple entity is like a quark, for instance, I'm happy to talk as if that's true. Um, but I'm not sure that I'm willing to use the words like commit to it, only because our best scientific theories would have said like 100 years ago that atoms were the most
Mm-hmm.
mereologically simple thing, and then we found out about protons, neutrons, and electrons, and then we thought that those were the most mereologically simple
Yeah, yeah.
things. So I think like committing yourself to that.
Well,
Um,
you can have temporally like sanctioned commitments to where like, okay,
okay,
at this current time, I'm committing to the existence of X.
yeah. So I think that that's fine to have like some kind of temporally contingent commitment, if that makes sense.
Gotcha. Okay.
That's
Yeah, cool. Um, okay, this is gonna be well. Okay, let me ask about the other thing then. So do you think that even if it is the case that properties are causally inert, and so we're not going to be able to like make some sort of empirical distinction between what is a true property versus a false property, do you think that there could be a way in which to, let's say, reason to the existence of universals through not necessarily some sort of falsification experiment, but rather through a sort of like principle of explanation, I guess? So like one way in which to maybe cash that out could be like, well, why? So you could ask, why is it the case that when I look at a apple and I look at my shirt, I will ascribe the property of redness to each of those two things? And we could say that if there is such a universal as redness, then that could help explain as to why it is the case that I see both of those two things. Whereas, like, I guess we could say for someone who's colorblind, like actually my father, he might not be able to distinguish the colors between two different things. And so that gives us some reason to be committed to something like there being colors that inhere within it, something.
Yeah, so I guess let me answer like the specific example as
Okay.
a way to illustrate like the broader point, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So like specifically with like a color. So, you know, I don't think that redness is like a real like I don't think that redness exists as universal. What I do think exists though are photons which bounce off of the atoms that make up your shirt, and they also bounce off the atoms that make up the apple. And enough energy is absorbed by that photon that when the photon bounces off, the amount of energy in that photon is the amount of energy that falls into the red spectrum, which, you know,
Mm-hmm.
the different colors of red might all fall within the same spectrum. And you have a fan. Um,
Nice.
and so in that sense, I might be skeptical of some kind of appeal to explanation through the use of universals. Um, but I'm hesitating. You hear hesitation in my voice because I don't think that I want to. I don't think that I want to close myself off to ever coming into some kind of uh, like, you know, if A then B, you know, or like, you know, if A, you know, universals exist, A therefore
Mm-hmm.
universals exist. I could see myself being convinced of the existence of universals through some kind of non-empirical argumentation. Like
Okay.
I can theorize that being the case, but it would need to like it would be really tricky for me, I think, because so many like syllogisms rely on the
Mm-hmm.
empirical. So like this syllogism would need to strictly be um it would like need to like strictly rely on like the logical laws and stuff like that, right? So
Mm-hmm.
like it would be tricky. I'm not like I can't imagine a way that it would work, but I don't want to close myself off to it, if that makes sense.
Not quite, but we might be able to get further through
Okay.
there as we go on. Okay, so then actually your answer there helps me out quite a bit in answering my previous question regarding like whether you're a scientific realist. And you said, no, I don't believe in colors per se. I believe in photons. And it
Yeah.
seems like because you don't empirically observe photons, it's just this sort of posit from science that you're like, oh, I accept that.
Well, so what do you mean by like empirically observe? Because like we do observe photons in the sense that like we can measure them. We can measure photons. Now
Yeah, yeah,
we can't take a picture of a photon, obviously,
yeah.
but like there's ways to measure photons and things like
Right.
that.
I was assuming you weren't like somebody who's actually measured photons,
Right.
but you take it from scientists. Yeah, yeah.
Right. Right.
And so then, yeah, yeah. So regarding the idea of being a sort of like fictionalist in regards to, let's say, mathematical entities, um, if it's the case that within science there's a sort of requirement to talk about things in using quantitative terms, which is like very numerical. And there's also these other things that science uses, like the postulation of photons and things like that. And you take one of those to be a sort of fictive sort of entity, and the other to be a factive entity. What is it that you use to sort of differentiate those two? Why is it the case that you're a realist for one but not the other when they're both sort of postulated by science?
I think that I'm a realist about the one, but a fictionalist about the other because the one is causally inert, but the other one is not causally inert, if that makes sense. So photons have, are causally active, but
Hmm.
numbers are not.
Hmm.
So I think that's why I'm cool with numbers, the universal number uh, being, not real,
Right.
but the photon being real, if that
Yeah.
makes sense.
I'm guessing you're familiar with certain strategies in responding to the fine-tuning argument, that of postulating, oh, we're just one universe in a
Mm-hmm.
vast array of many universes. And it
Familiar
seems like,
with?
yeah,
Yes. Expert in?
okay.
No. And also, I
Are you
think that I'm.
sympathetic towards it?
Yes, I was just gonna say
Okay.
that I think I'm probably more sympathetic to like fine tuning arguments
Mhm.
than a lot of like my
Oh, I see.
nominalist,
Gotcha.
colleagues.
Yeah, yeah. I thought you were saying you were sympathetic towards that response, but maybe not.
No, no, actually, and this might just be a function of my ignorance, to be honest, but like I don't look at like the multiverse stuff as being like worth looking into a whole lot
Mm,
because it kind of just seems like conjecture at this point. Now,
right.
again, that's quite possibly just a function of my ignorance. But sorry, I'm distracting from
Yeah.
your point. Sorry.
Yeah, yeah. So the point I was making is that it seems like certain theoretical explanations for, let's say, the fine tuning of our universe are going to include entities that aren't we're not able to causally interact with at all.
Hmm.
That being the multiplication of many universes out there. It's not the case that you or I can go out and measure the
Hmm.
other universes.
Yeah.
And it seems like that's still a sort of scientific or quasi-scientific explanation that could be made for the certain things that we do observe, that
Hmm.
being like our particular universe. But I don't know if you're not sympathetic at all to that sort of response, then maybe I can see why you wouldn't also be sympathetic towards like the idea of numbers or universals.
Yeah. And then the other explanation for why things might be fine tuned is a god, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there are some people who think that God would be entirely causally inert, but I find that tends to be a rather small subset of people who believe in a god because the Christian conception of God is that he's not causally inert, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I'm pretty sympathetic to this idea of some non-causally inert God that is kind of like the guy who started everything.
Mm-hmm.
I'm frankly, and now I'm an agnostic still. I'm not a theist, but I'm frankly more sympathetic to that idea than I am to the multiverse idea. Because the multiverse idea to me seems even less like empirically verifiable than some
Mm-hmm.
kind of causally active God. So
Right.
that's just how my brain works. And again, I should just specify that I am an idiot and I don't know what
Same.
I'm talking about when it comes to like multiverse stuff. There are people much smarter than me who talk about this stuff like they know what they're talking about, and
Yeah.
if they don't know what they talk about, then they've got me fooled. And so I try not to weigh in too much on it because I just
Mm-hmm.
don't know a whole lot about it. But that's where I
Um,
am now.
yeah. So I know, okay, it's becoming clear that like a significant portion of your reasons for rejecting realism regarding property is due to the fact that they would be causally inert. Um, are we sure that that's like a strong commitment to realism? Because like now I'm not like an Aristotelian scholar or anything like that, but as I sort of understand it, Aristotle's like conception of property realism is going to be kind of different from Plato's, and
Mm-hmm.
it's not the case that there's the form of, let's say, redness that sort of imbues or is causally inert, but is somehow like um, ex- expressed within certain objects. It seems like for Aristotle, he would say that there are real universals that adhere within the objects themselves. This is kind of weird, but if it seems like he would say, let's say, the property of goodness. I guess he wouldn't say that there's the form of the good, which within which all good things sort of like conform to, but rather there is a sort of particular goodness inherent to certain things that is sort of expressed. And I'm wondering if like his sort of notion of realism might be more causally friendly in that like he might say, oh, there's a sort of form of humanness that we put off basically just by existing, and that people with an intellect can be able to sort of recognize that form of humanness and sort of extract from that a sort of like maybe logical syllogism regarding their humanity.
Yeah, so I am like more sympathetic with the moderate realist than I am
Mm.
with the Platonic realist. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Now, I will confess that I'm like much more familiar with moderate realism a la Aquinas than I am
Hmm.
a la Aristotle. But
Hmm.
the way that I understand them in my very smooth brain is that Aristotle and Aquinas are more on the same page than Plato. So um, I'm gonna address my response to like a moderate conception of
Sure.
realism with the understanding that I could just be totally misunderstanding your question. So let's see how I do. Um, I do think that um, Aquinas was moving Platonism closer to like the Enlightenment, kind of, if I'm putting things on like a spectrum, whereby while Plato's realism was these real entities exist inside of Plato's cave and all that. Aquinas kind of took those and then instantiated them within particulars. So like I think Aquinas would say something like redness wouldn't exist if no red things exist, while Plato would say like no, redness would exist even if no red things existed. That's how I understand the main difference to be. Um, and so like I'm more sympathetic to a moderate realism than a Platonic realism. Um, However, I still reject both forms of realism because they both seem to fall prey to the causal inertness argument.
Okay. So the way that I sort of understand it, the reason that like when I look at a red apple and I see the color red from it is because like at least on a moderate realist account is because that color red is there within that apple. If it were the case that the color red was not there within the apple, I would not experience that color of redness. So it seems like that's a sort of like causal description in some sense because like through my interaction with the apple, that's what's leading me to have the experience of the color red. It's because it has that property.
Yeah, so I think that perhaps Aristotle thought about things in like a causal way, but like today we can actually look for the redness and we see that like we don't find any redness. What we do find are electrons. Photons.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and really the photons are like what we think of as like redness. Color is not like an actual property that objects have, right? um, the property that objects have are that they're made up of atoms, and
Mm-hmm.
that when photons bounce off those atoms they start wiggling at a certain frequency, and then
Uh-huh.
our eyes, when the photons hit our eyes, we interpret those wiggly photons in a certain way that we describe as redness. So I
Yeah.
think that when you drill down and you look for the causality of redness, you'll find that the thing that's causing us to see the red is not actually the red, it's the photon, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So it seems like there's a sort of interpretive framework that we can approach to these sorts of things, and it seems like you're sort of going at it in a more eliminativist framework, in that
Yes.
like there's no such thing as redness. What there really is are these photons
Mhm.
behaving at a certain frequency. Whereas if you're maybe more of a reductionist, you could say no, there is such a thing as redness. What redness is constituted by photons behaving at a particular frequency. Um, yeah, and so maybe I'm more inclined to say like, no, there are red things, and what it means to be red is to reflect photons at a particular frequency.
Yeah, yeah. And so I'm actually in the middle of, and I'm just gonna grab the book real quick. I'm
Mm-hmm.
in the middle of Josh Rasmussen's Who Are You Really?
Oh yeah, nice.
And so I'm only 100 pages in, but the first little bit has been like the difference between reductionism versus eliminativism. And he's specifically talking about the self. So he's kind of
Mm-hmm.
talking about like mind body dualism and stuff like
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
But concepts still apply here. So that was the tie in. But I am sympathetic to. So I'm reading the book, right? So my mind might change before I get to the end of the book. But I do think of myself right now as an eliminativist. Um, and
Of the self, or okay,
yeah,
in
of
this regard.
both, like
Okay,
of pretty much, of all substances, kind of all
yeah.
universals, of which I would consider, well, maybe the self isn't a universal, but I actually do reject the self if you were referring to like a metaphysical core or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
That we can get
Yeah,
there,
yeah.
because I don't think I've actually addressed your point yet. Um, and so uh with regard to redness simply being photons, like I'm sympathetic to that idea to an extent, but then I'm not sure why we can't, like, I still think that this would be something that Occam's razor would be able to, like, shave off, in the sense that, like, why do I need to posit, like, I don't need to posit this universal of redness in order to explain, like, the qualia redness, the experience of seeing red.
Okay, so I definitely want to sort of maybe transition over into philosophy of mind, because I think that's going to come in,
I think you're right.
especially in discussion to qualia. But one last thing I want to sort of bring up is it the case that when we talk about things like chemicals, photons, quarks, and things like that, that we're still going to be like relying upon this sort of like commonality between objects in the world? Like when we say that redness, or like redness is really just photons behaving at a particular frequency. It seems like we're talking about photons as a sort of class, or as something with a common essence across them. And so would you just sort of like say, oh no, I'm speaking fictionally here?
So I've said it before and I'll say it again. I think that if anything will turn me from a nominalist into a realist, it would be some kind of appeal, not even to photons, but to energy or to fields. Because, like, energy seems to be a thing that, like, really does exist. But, like, energy, like, very well might be a universal. Like, it's weird to think about, like, particular energy, if that makes sense. So that's like the area where my nominalism is the weakest, if that makes sense. With photons, it does appear to me that there are just individual photons.
It doesn't?
It does appear to me as if there's just individual photons. So I think photons are less of a concern to me, because photons are examples of concreta, as far as I can tell. Because, like, we know that there are multiple photons, and, like, we can interact with photons here but not over here and stuff like that. But the same is not true of energy. So I like where that train of thought was going. But I feel less moved by the application of that to photons and to atoms and quarks and all that. But I feel more moved by the application of that to energy and fields.
Okay, so then a little bit confused, because like I was bringing up photons as just going to be something that we have to posit a sort of common essence between. And maybe this gets into what you were saying earlier, that like realism provides us with an account of like how to make inferences. Because like if it's the case that photons are the particular thing that will behave in such and such a way, this will sort of determine, I guess, whether or not this thing is a photon or not, based upon how it's able to behave. Like we could say that photons are emitted by some LED frequency, or something like that, and that's going to be what we mean by a photon. And so if there is this sort of common essence across photons, then we're going to be able to make inferences about what the photon will do. Like it's going to be the case that if I emit this light, this photon, it's going to do something, and then I can know what a future photon that I emit will do as well. And so for that reason, we should think that, oh, there's some sort of commonality between these two things so that I can make such inferences. But maybe, I don't know, you bite the bullet with Hume's problem of induction?
Yes. So I do bite the bullet with Hume's problem of induction. And I think Spartan theology actually kind of just said what, like, I think he just kind of asked the same question that you asked, right? So if there are individual photons, what makes them all photons and not just random things that are similar? So I think that, like, the difference between the realist and the nominalist is that the nominalist just bites the bullet. It says, like, they aren't all photons in, like, this universal photon sense. They are all just different things that behave the same way. So I think that's what the nominalist says there.
Yeah, so it's true that they do behave in this particular way, but you're not going to be able to say that it's true that they will and can only behave in this particular way, right?
Correct. The nominalist has no way of saying, yeah.
Okay. Okay.
I actually think that there's worse bullets that the nominalist bites. Like I think that, so I'm going to tie in a question from earlier. Christopher Rice asked, how do you define love? This is like, I don't talk to my wife about this because I define love as, like, some kind of, interaction of chemicals and electrical impulses in your brain, which is so unromantic. Like that's so unromantic. So that's how I define love. It's not
At
romantic.
least it's a reductive account instead of an eliminative account, though.
Yes, but I think if I was, so I should say, like, strictly speaking, love doesn't exist. What does exist are the chemicals in your brain that we describe as love fictionally. That's that's what I would say. You know, if I was speaking precisely.
Gotcha.
And that's another bullet that I bite. But in my opinion, the worst bullet that I have to bite is that, like, strictly speaking, 1 + 1 does not equal 2. Why? Because 1 doesn't exist and 2 doesn't exist. So it makes no sense to say 1 + 1 equals 2. Now I can say that, like, you know, one pen and another pen is 2 pens, because now I've applied like individuals to them. But I can't just say that 1 + 1 is 2.
Well, wouldn't that inference to 2 pins still be relying upon some sort of commonality of numbers to where that you can infer that, yeah, if I add 2 pins together, I'm going to get, sorry, if I add one pin to another pin, I'm going to get 2 pins. That's something that's requiring.
Yeah. So strictly speaking, I can't even say that, like, with any kind of, like, certainty, but I can just say every time that we've measured adding 1 pen with another pen, we always get, we've so far we've always gotten 2 pens.
Yeah.
So I can
you're
say
just guessing what's going to happen.
Yeah, I can say with 99.9%, you know, whatever certainty that it's going to be 2 pens, but I can't do this inductive move where I'm saying, like, oh, because of, you know, because universals are really there, then it must be the case.
Yeah, I mean, that's still falling into the rabbit hole of induction, which, like, Hume himself was like, yeah, you can't make that sort of inference. But okay, yeah, okay. Do you want? Let's move on a little bit to philosophy of mind. So I know you said you were saying you're more eliminativist in regards to the self, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and so eliminativist in the sense that you don't think there's, like, a persistent self, or you don't even think that there's, like, a subject of experience, a thinking thing, something like that?
Yeah, so here's how I kind of think of the self. I think of the self as a so when I say self, I'm speaking fictionally, and what I'm referring to is the collection of mereological simples arranged Kevin-wise. And there is this thing that does, like, so I have memories, and my memories keep on, like, you know, new memories come in and old memories fade away. And so, like, in that sense, if you want to talk about persisting over time, I'm, like, a little sympathetic to the idea that, like, yes, like, the collection of mereological simples arranged Kevin-wise today is actually different than the collection of mereological simples arranged Kevin-wise yesterday. Why? Because I've eaten new things. So, like, there's new atoms in my body that weren't there yesterday. But, like, what persists over time? Like, well, like, you know, this collection of mereological simples has a brain that's arranged pretty darn similarly to the way that it was arranged yesterday. So, like, a lot of the same memories are still there. Now, what are memories, right? It's memories are brain states, you know, according to me, right? And who am I? But like, all of this is kind of like me just trying to shy away from the fact that I'm saying that, like, the self doesn't actually exist, right? So I think that if I'm going to speak, like, if I'm going to be strictly speaking, I think I just need to say, like, yeah, I just reject this concept of the self.
Yeah, okay. So, yeah, here's an interesting question then. Like, I'm sure you're familiar with the transporter in Star Trek that, like, basically takes all your atoms and then creates produces a clone. And I don't know, it seems like, at least for me, I don't think that the self would survive that. I feel like by annihilating or, like, detaching all these atoms from each other, I would cease to exist. But it seems like if you take a sort of reductive account that the self is just a particular structure of a brain shaped Kevin-wise that has a particular set of memories, then yeah, that's what it means to be Kevin. And so it seems like you would have to say, yeah, there is a sort of persistence across the transporter. Is that right?
Yeah, so I would be comfortable saying that, like, after I went through the transporter, I'm happy to say that I still exist on the other side, even though all the atoms that used to make me up are now, like, in a heap on the floor of the spaceship, but I was reconstructed out of all the atoms on the planet below the spaceship. So every single atom is different, but the arrangement is all the same, and I have all the same memories and stuff. I'm happy to say that really is me. Why?
Right.
Because I am the arrangement And if the arrangement is still the same, I'm happy to say that that's still me.
Yeah. So if there was like some sort of error with the transporter where the first subject was reconstituted to where now there's a Kevin that's over in the Andromeda Galaxy and another Kevin that's here on Earth, is that going to be a case where you have Kevin exists in two different places at the same time?
Yeah, but I would suppose that like now there's like a branch of Kevin in the sense that like they're gonna start collecting new atoms and stuff like that. You know what I mean? And they're gonna start creating different memories and all that. So like I would just say that like yeah. So now there's two different like if you took like an exact slice of time where the arrangements are exactly the same, I would say like yes at that for that precise moment, two Kevins existed, but then as soon as that moment ends, like oh, you know, you took a breath in. Oh, now there's new atoms in your body, and there's different atoms in my body now. So you know what I mean. So now it is arranged differently.
Gotcha. But okay, so then your understanding of like the self is almost like a conventional thing that we use to sort of
Yes.
like just okay, gotcha,
Yeah.
gotcha.
Which is why I was saying, like, strictly speaking, I think I just need to like, put on my big boy pants and just commit to the denial of the self.
Yeah.
Like I do all this work to try to like talk about the self, you know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah.
But I think at the end of the day, like the most honest thing that I can do is just be like, no, it's the self doesn't really exist.
Okay, so here's since the self is sort of a more, I don't know, it's almost secondary in my sense to other areas in philosophy of mind that are maybe more important. That would be like the idea of quality or what it's like to experience some particular thing, the quality of a sensation or something like that. And so it seems like if you take a very reductive account in regards to what there is, as just the fluctuations of atoms and photons and energy waves and things like that, that's not going to be a complete picture of the world by my picture, given if it precludes the existence of subjective experience. So like what I was saying before is like when I look at an apple and a photon is reflected at a particular frequency, I can say that that apple is red. And I'm talking about the qualitative experience of redness that I'm experiencing from looking at the apple. But if the qualitative experience of redness is not something that science itself talks about at all, does that mean that you're rejecting that there is such an experience, or do you have to say no, there's some things that science just doesn't have access to?
Yeah, so I think like strictly speaking, I do just like reject experience, but if I'm going to speak about it, I'm going to say something like there are brain states, like what we describe as experiences are just chemicals and electrical signals in your brain, like firing back and forth and all that.
Yeah. Okay. So you want to say that there are no such things as experiences, but what people typically refer to as experiences are really going to be neurochemicals and transfer of energy and things like that.
Yeah.
Without any of this sort of qualitative aspects to that. Is that right?
Yeah, like we feel these things, like we say that we see red, but like what is actually happening is those wiggly photons are hitting our eyeballs, and then an electrical impulse is generated by the eyeball receiving that wiggly photon, and that electrical impulse is sent from your eyeball to your brain. That's why some people can be blind with perfectly well, like with eyes that are perfect, right? If the connection between your eye and your brain is severed, then you're blind. So I think that like all these experiences are describable by, photons and electrical impulses and all that stuff.
Yeah. Okay. And I'm guessing that would also include the subjective experience of pain as well. So like if I hit a hammer to my nail, all that's really going on there is going to be the neurochemical displacement.
I think that we can explain pain entirely by describing the state of the pressure applied to your hand and the cells in your hand. As they compress, they send out whatever kind of, I don't know how pain works, but they send out the electrical impulse to the nerves in your hand that shoot up to your brain or whatever. I think that we can explain 100% of pain through appealing only to those kind of physical processes.
Right. So you would never have to talk about what it's like, what it feels like to be in pain, and how it's like a negative phenomenological sort of experience or anything like that.
Right. I mean, I could explain how we don't like it because, like, that feeling, like, humans have evolved such that the feeling of the pain, which we're describing only in like physiological terms, actually
Hmm.
winds up decreasing your dopamine levels. And the reason why your dopamine levels were decreased is because, you know, natural selection selected the human body to decrease your dopamine levels after experiencing pain, because pain normally means danger. You're not going to be able to reproduce if you don't survive. You better survive so you can reproduce. Whatever, you know.
Hmm.
But that's kind of how I think about things like pain and experience and stuff.
And are you satisfied by that picture of the world? Because at least for me, like talking about pain without talking about the phenomenological sort of experience of it is going to be an insufficient account of pain.
So satisfy is kind of like a funny word. You saw me start to look over my shoulder because I have a bookshelf. It's just out of camera, but there's a bookshelf right there, and it's filled with like high fantasy fiction. I'm
Oh
a
yeah, I see
huge fan of Lord of the Rings, and I'm a huge fan of The Wheel of Time and Stormlight Archive and Mistborn and whatever. And so I'm not satisfied.
it.
And I turn to fiction to get that satisfaction
Uh-huh.
because the world is less magical to me now than it used to be when I was a realist. Like realism has some kind of magic to it, you know what I mean?
Hmm.
That like nominalism, the magic is kind of gone. So in that like emotional sense of the word, am I satisfied? No. But like in an intellectual sense of the word, am I satisfied? Yes, in the sense that like I do think that I properly explain the phenomenon
Hmm.
under nominalism.
Okay. Yeah, yeah. I wasn't meaning in the emotional sense of satisfaction, but
Yeah,
in regards to like, no,
you
no,
clarified
I'm
and then
sure
I
that, yeah,
yeah.
yeah, I'm sure that this is something that exists, and you're like, no, yeah, there's nothing more than this, and so like, I don't think that there's more to the world than these things. Um, yeah,
I know,
yeah.
I know.
The
It's
denial of the
uncom
existence of pain, one of the most certain things that we can experience at
Yeah.
any time.
Now, now, yeah, I know. And I struggled with this for a long time, but I think that for me, um, the thing that wound up making me more or less like sleep okay at night, even denying the existence of pain, is that I'm not actually denying the existence of anything that we can actually causally interact with.
Well, I can cause you to have pain.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And if we were like measuring my body while we did that, we would see that you know, we could perfectly describe the pain in terms of the physiological response. So I'm not denying anything that like I'm not denying any of the physiological stuff. You know what I
No,
mean?
I'm saying I can cause you to feel the subjective quality of experiencing a negative phenomenological state.
Right? But
I
I
mean, I'd have to find you first, but
right. Yeah. I'll send you my address when this is
okay,
over so you can, you know,
get my
we can
hammer.
do this experiment together, you
Yeah,
know,
yeah,
for science.
yeah, yeah.
But I think I think what makes me kind of be at peace with this is that everything that I need to describe the actual phenomenon
Mhm.
I'm cool with. Like I'm cool with everything that we need to describe it. I'm just not cool with the stuff that we don't need to describe it.
Yeah, okay. So, yeah, moving over away from philosophy of mind now, I feel like we got to go into epistemology because, like, at least for me, like, the way that I know things is through my sensory experiences, and I base off, I infer about what is in the world from what I'm most confident in order to raise my confidence in those things. So, like, I'm pretty confident that Australia exists because, like, I've experienced people that say they're from Australia.
Yeah.
I've never like personally experienced it myself, but yeah. And so I don't want to go like full Cartesian or anything like that, but I do think that he has something right in that like what we can be most confident in is our inner experience of the world and also of our own sense of self. Because even if it were the case that like some Cartesian demon was like bringing illusions regarding all my experiences of the external world, there'd be still at least something that was having that illusion. Uh, but okay, so do you like reject that sort of line of thinking, or
Not strictly.
yeah?
I don't reject it. I just can explain all of it in terms of just there needs to be some kind of thing that's capable of experiencing. And that thing of that is capable of experiencing, as far as I can tell, is totally describable using only like the amount of atoms that it would take to create the proverbial brain in the vat. So like there must be at least a brain in the vat. But I think that like the brain in the vat is totally explainable through.
Right, but in our neuroscientific descriptions, are we ever saying anything like, "Oh, okay, this collection of atoms is capable of experiencing the phenomenological, qualitative experience of pain"? Like, is that something that science sort of talks about, or is science sort of strictly bound to what is third person observationally measurable?
Um, so big questions, right? um, so, um, I think that science is done best when we remove as much of the self as we can, in the sense that, like, the less that we have to rely upon human, like, interaction, the better. Um, However, it's obviously impossible to escape entirely because, like, if we removed 100% of human interaction, then like humans would never know the results of the experiment.
Yeah. Okay. So here's an interesting thought experiment, I guess. Let's suppose like we went back in time and dropped Aristotle like alone on a beach, basically, to sort of like conduct his science. Um, there would never be like there would never be any sort of okay, so there would never be any disagreements that he would have with other sort of scientists or anything like that. But it seems like he would be able to experience this sort of well, all the objects of his science would be occurring through his first personal awareness or experience of those objects. And it seems like it's only when we sort of add another person in, let's say Plato, as being a second scientist to be there alongside of him, that there's going to be this area that is not reachable, is not jointly reachable by both parties. For Aristotle, he can self-reflect as to how he's experiencing particular things, but Plato cannot like perceive what Aristotle is feeling at that point in time. It seems weird to say that like the area of science like diminishes through the inclusion of a second person. Oh, sure, yeah, they can check each other's work when there's two of them, but yeah, I don't know. It's like the picture I have, at least, of scientists is it's done through scientists. It's not the case that you can have science without scientists or subjects who are making observations and like considering what those observations entail and different things like that. So
Yeah. So what I meant was like by like removing the like the self as much as possible is something like this. So you can imagine like two different experiments that are exactly the same, except that one requires a person to take the measurement themselves versus the other, the exact same measurement is actually performed by like a computer. I would have higher confidence in the one where the measurement is performed by the computer because I think that removing as much like manual input is going to create more reliable results. That's essentially all that I meant. And I do agree that like at the end of the day, everything is like subjective, you know, so I will never learn about science unless I learn about science, you know, like, you know, so at the end of the day, it will all come down to like the, you know, the photons have to bounce off of the piece of paper that I read in order for me to ingest the information. So in that sense, like the subjectivity of it is inescapable. But I think science is done best when we reduce the subjectivity as much as possible.
all right, this is going to feel like a stupid question. Are you a historical realist? And by that, I mean, do you think that there are certain facts about like the way that the world was? And as a follow-up to that, because I'm assuming, yeah, like you are, do you think that history is the sort of thing that can be established through science?
So yes, I'm a historical realist in the sense that I think that things really did happen in the past. No, I don't think that history can be done in the same way that science can. That's one of
Right.
like my biggest like I've been getting more into like, you know, like biblical history and stuff like that recently,
Mhm.
and it's all very frustrating to me because I'm an engineer, right? I have an
Yeah,
engineering
yeah.
degree, and so I want everything to be super empirical and be like, well, let's just
Uh-huh.
perform this test, and then we can find out
Yeah,
exactly,
yeah,
what hour did Jesus die? Was it 9 or was it 12? Well, let's just perform this test and find out. It doesn't work like that in history. So no,
yeah.
I acknowledge that history is not done empirically. Like, no, well, there's empirical aspects to history, but
Right,
history is not like that. So
right.
yeah,
And
and
so
it's
you just say science is a harder science than, say, history would be.
yeah, and even among the sciences, there are some harder sciences than others. Like
Uh-huh.
I think that like a lot of like the psychology kind of fields are like babies compared to things like physics, in the
Mm.
sense that like I just think that we don't know what the heck is going on with like the human
Mhm.
brain compared to how much we know about Newtonian mechanics.
Yeah,
So
yeah. Okay, so at least I'm happy to say that you're not a scientist or a scientismist, I guess, because you
right.
do accept that there are some historical truths that science itself is not able to provide us with.
But
Although,
I am
yeah,
like, as like, so the way that I often describe my views is that like I'm as close to an empiricist without
mhm.
actually being an empiricist, if that makes sense. Um, and thanks, Spartan theology. Yeah, well played, well
Yeah,
played.
yeah,
um, but uh, I'm like as
yeah.
close to being like committing an act of scientism as I can
Mhm,
physically be without actually committing to scientism, if that makes sense. Like
mhm.
I'm dangerously close.
Yeah, okay. Uh, okay, then, so yeah, you accept that there are some historical truths. And then, okay, so here's the question then, like, what is the means by which we arrive at historical conclusions regarding the past? Like, how is it that we can know that Caesar crossed the Rubicon or something like that?
Yeah, so if by no we mean like absolute knowledge, then like we can't. But if by
No.
no we just mean some kind of like justified belief, then we just have to look at what evidence we have and then come to what we think is the most probable conclusion. And
Right. So
that's the
that would
best
be
we
a
can
sort of
do.
abductive reasoning then.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And so yeah, I do think um yeah, even though the past can't like directly interact with us or we with it, it does seem like yeah, we can make sort of abductive inferences regarding the past as well. Hmm. Okay.
Yeah.
I feel like this whole area we've gone through
And
a lot there. Do you
we
want to
have.
move
And
on to a different topic? Yeah.
I've got a few questions queued up.
Okay.
And then I also have just like I'll kind of say something I think that kind of almost like backs up your history point there, and that's just
Mm.
that I'm like way less confident in like even the most like well established historical fact
Mm.
than I am in a fact like um the speed or like the weight of a proton or something like that. You know what I mean?
Okay.
Like
Yeah. Yeah. So then that just sparks my question. What is something that you're most confident in? What fact?
Um, does blind confidence count? Because the logical laws, like the law
Mm,
of identity, like X is equal to X, like I
mhm,
blindly accept that that is the case. I
mm,
cannot empirically prove it to you. I take it as just I don't like, I'm super uncomfortable with the world if that's not the case. So I'm going
mhm,
to act as if it's the case, even though I can't empirically prove it. So
mhm.
but am I actually like sure about that? Like, well, I'm gonna tell you I am, but I'm
Yeah.
kind of not. You know what I mean? I'm kind of not.
Yeah.
Um, so then if you're trying to go for something that I'm not just kind of like almost presupposing in like a very Calvinist kind of way, like what am I the most sure of? Um,
Yeah. Of the synthetic truths.
yeah. Um, I guess it'll be something super super general, like there is a reality. Like that's something that I'm like the most sure of. Like there is a
Mm,
reality.
okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
if you want me to drill down deeper, like other things that I'm like really
Mhm,
darn sure of is like there is a thing in that reality that has that the laws of physics work together in such a way that this thing describes itself as having experiences. That would be me. Like that's my understanding of the self. Um, and then something else that I'm like really, really, really darn sure of is something that I've like tested myself. So I've done the experiment where you can measure the size of the Earth just by like measuring the stars and stuff like that. I did it like a long time ago.
Uh,
And I've also looked out on a plane and measured the curvature of the Earth. So like I'm really, really sure that the Earth is like, generally speaking, like a sphere. Like it's an oblong sphere. That's something that I'm like really, really sure about.
yeah.
So stuff like that.
Okay, so then when you say something like you're really sure or really confident that there's something in reality that describes itself as having experiences, are you speaking fictionally in that regard? Because like if you're a mereological nihilist, you don't think that there's composite objects at all. So you don't think there's a composite object which describes itself.
I think that there's a collection of mereological symbols that describes itself as
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
I know mereological nihilism makes everything super inconvenient to talk about because you have to start describing everything as a collection of mereological symbols arranged thing-wise, and that's so inconvenient that I just don't do it, and I speak with the vulgar. But when I have a conversation with somebody like you, I should speak more precisely than I do.
Yeah. And to be even more precise, you don't think that there's there's not a class of things called mereological symbols, right? That's not something that they share a common attribute with, right?
No, like I wouldn't say that there's like a universal. I would say that there's a whole bunch of concrete mereological symbols.
Which can interact with each other in such a way that they describe themselves as having experiences. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, so do you think that when those mereological symbols describes themselves as having experiences, are they describing a fact of reality, or are they describing are they in error with that description?
It's an error in the sense that like they're not like it's not that the experience itself exists in some kind of realist way, but what actually does exist are the mereological symbols arranged brain-wise are receiving electrical impulses from the mereological symbols arranged nerve-wise in their hand when the mereological symbols arranged hammer-wise smack into the mereological symbols arranged hand-wise.
So one of the things that you're most confident in is that there's something that is in error.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. But so I don't think about it like I wouldn't say that I'm confident in the error. What I would say is like I'm confident that all of those things that I just described actually exist.
I see. So yeah, it could be the case that they you're less confident, I guess, let's see, in a limit of materialism regarding the subjective experience. And so they could be describing themselves accurately. You just think that that's probably an inaccurate description.
Right.
Okay. Yeah.
But the thing exists. But whether the thing is the collection of mereological symbols arranged, in a way that is describing itself in under error theory, or whether I'm wrong about nominalism and that and I'm wrong about the self and all that. Either one of those could be the case, but it still is the case that there is this thing that is experiencing something. So. Man, we got so general there. Like it's like so like zoomed out.
Yeah. Okay. Did you want to go over the questions then?
Yeah. Let's do some questions. So, I wouldn't mind revisiting Christopher's question about how do you define love? Because I answered it, but I didn't send it to you. Okay. After that, we'll go to some math stuff. But how do you define love?
The willing of the good of the other for their own sake, I think. I think that's a pretty good definition of love.
That's a very Catholic answer. I like it.
Exactly, yeah.
Cool. Okay. Let's do a math question. So Spartan Theology said, and this is kind of more for me, but I think that you'll be able to like riff on this idea. So, if that's the case about math, as in like if nominalism is right and like it's strictly speaking false, so 1 + 1 = 2, then when you get to higher complex math, wouldn't the probability that it corresponds to predictions in reality be so low that it's crazy how it actually does correspond? And so my response to that is when you get to really higher level maths, you start getting to think so, and I'm talking like I'm a mathematician. Let me qualify my math credentials. The highest level maths that I've ever done is linear algebra. So Calc 4 is the highest level math that I've done. So high-ish, like as high as math goes in undergrad. I don't have a graduate degree. I've never done graduate level math. So let me make that known that I'm not a mathematician. But when you start getting to upper level maths, a lot of it doesn't actually have like a correspondence in reality. So like things that I like to think about are like imaginary numbers or things like Aleph Null and stuff like that. There is no the square root of -1 doesn't have a correspondence in reality, really.
Is it, now maybe I'm mistaken, but is it the case that Einstein's constant does include an imaginary number in there somewhere?
I don't recall. So I'm a chemical engineer. So I've done high level chemistry, but my physics is kind of all like material sciences and stuff like that. So I never really did any kind of like Einstein stuff. So I am not equipped to answer that question.
Okay, gotcha. But, yeah, I could be completely mistaken.
But what I can say is that the square root of -1, is used in like upper level thermo and stuff like that. And so the square root of -1, is a useful tool to describe certain describes the way that certain things will behave. But it's not like there doesn't exist any I number of anything, because the square root of -1 isn't like a real thing that like it's. And I think that virtually everybody is going to be like a nominalist about I. Like nobody, I don't think anybody thinks that I, the square root of -1, like really does exist. And so like the nominalist just kind of goes harder and says like, no, like all of the numbers are just like I. They're all imaginary. They're all lacking like, real existence.
Yeah.
So what do you think about that?
It seems like his question is almost kind of getting at William Lane Craig's most recent like favorite apologetic argument for God's existence is the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics. And I think it makes a lot more sense as an argument when you posit nominalism, kind of like Craig does, because it is kind of weird that like all these things that we made up actually like really pretty accurately describe the world, to the point that we're able to make like significant predictions as to how the world will behave, and those predictions actually are right. That's wild.
It is pretty wild. And I will even agree that math is like super effective, but here's where I kind of like pause a little bit. Oops, sorry, my cat just jumped up. Here she is. Cat tax. Here she is. So that's Molly, by the way.
Hey, Molly.
But there's this whole debate about whether math is invented or discovered. And I am not a mathematician, so I really shouldn't weigh in here. But I'm more on the math is invented than the math is discovered train. And there are really, really smart people who exist on both sides of the spectrum, whether math is invented or created. So like strictly speaking, I'm agnostic on the matter. I lean towards math is created, like invented rather than discovered. But that's just me. Spartan Theology said, hey, he's an engineer too. Engineers unite. Now, are you an electrical engineer? Because you say imaginary numbers are used in electrical engineering all the time. Yes, they are. They're used to describe like phenomenon that happen in the real world. But just because it's useful to describe something doesn't mean that it exists in reality, if that makes sense. Like you can divide by 0, and sometimes you do divide by 0 in like actual math. And it's supposed to tell you that like the math equation was set up wrong from the beginning, but like there's no like correspondence in reality to like something where you divide by 0. You don't like it doesn't make sense. So and Spartan Theology went on to say, oh no, I must have messed up if I agree with William Lane Craig. Hey, I agree with William Lane Craig on a couple of points in as much as we're both nominalists. But hey, look, I don't have a problem with William Lane Craig. I mean, I think he's wrong about some stuff. And Spartan says, no, I'm a civil engineer, the dumbest kind. Oh my gosh. I have two cousins with civil engineering degrees, and my dad's a mechanical engineer. So we have a lot of engineers in the family. I'm the only chemical engineer, and so I act as if chemical engineering is clearly the most superior kind of. None of them is better than the other. We all suffer together. Engineering school is awful. So solidarity between engineers. That's all I have to say about that. So thanks, Spartan Theology. What's up, Hallie? Hallie says, if a theologian is a person who prays, is a mathematician one who maths? I think so. Well, what if a theologian is somebody who theologizes? Is that what a theologian does? Do they theologize?
Right.
These are the real questions. These are the real questions. Okay. I think that I got to all the questions, and we've been at it for just over an hour. So, John, was there anything that you wanted to kind of get in before we started to wrap it up?
No, I think, yeah, we went over a large gambit of different conversation topics that worked well into each other. So I was happy about that. Yeah, I really appreciate you just sort of like laying out your worldview a little bit more and giving me a better understanding of like sort of where you're coming from. And yeah, okay. Okay, there is this one area that's tangentially related, and I kind of want to run it past you. In some of the conversations that I've listened that you had with people, it seems like you've kind of been articulating your view in a almost like non-substantivalist sort of view of properties. So what is it? It's like Hume's view that like a substance is really just a conglomeration of properties put together. I don't know. Would you subscribe to something like that? Property, what's the term by Hume? It's like property connection. It's bugging me. But I don't know. If that, yeah, that might not be how you describe yourself.
So I have to admit that I actually started reading some papers for a video that I should have coming out later this week about substances, and I'm more confused now than I was when I started. So I've been operating as if substances are universals this whole time. And I just read a paper that was published in the 70s where this guy, it was in the Philosophical Review, so it's like a respected journal. And this guy was arguing that substances are not universals. They are like concreta. And I'm like, wait a minute, if that's the case. But then another paper that I read was talking about how like Aristotle actually kind of changed the way that he used the word over time. So in like Metaphysics 4, which was one of the last books that he wrote, he was talking about substances as if they were like more universal. But in, I forget the first book that he wrote, not Metaphysics, it's before that.
Physics?
No, not physics either. What's the one, doesn't matter. That he was talking about it. So I'm almost wondering if like Aristotle himself used the word in different ways at different times. But if substances are some kind of universal, then I don't think that they exist because I'm a nominalist. And if somebody has some kind of concrete conception of a universal, I guess I'm like open to the idea. I'm sorry, a concrete conception of a substance. Kevin. But I guess I'm like, I guess I'm more open to that, I guess. But when you ask me like, what do you think about a substance right now? My response is kind of like, I don't know, man. Like, I don't rely on them in my language, except to say that like, I don't understand what people mean by them. I'm going to choose to ignore them until, pre-metaphysics. Thank you, Spartan Theology. That's the book, not physics, pre-metaphysics. But yeah, so
meta just means after, right? So
it does. Like, meta just means after physics.
Comes after the physics.
Yeah.
It's not okay.
Yeah. Pre-metaphysics 101. I took that class in college. Yeah.
Okay, so that helps me. Yeah, I remember now. It's bundle theory. Bundle theory is the thing postulated by Hume that he understands substances as just a bundle of properties sort of built together. So there's what it means to say that there's an apple there is that you have redness, crispness, sort of like green leafness or something like that, all bundled together. But I don't know. Yeah, that might not be like a view that you would endorse at all, given that you don't accept properties.
Without getting too much into it, because I know we've been going for a little while, I read two really cool papers. One was, so you can think about these as kind of bundle theory, but for scientists. There was one that was saying Like imagine bundle theory, but instead we're going to say that a thing is like so it was trying to come up with a justification for composite objects, and it was using thermodynamics as a way to determine what might be a composite object. So they might say that like an apple is this thing that has all the bundle theory things that you might mention, like crispness and redness and sweetness and whatever. But then also it would have to be one composite object, where a composite object is an object in which heat can transfer between the atoms, not through like through induction. Like if it can travel through induction, then you're good. So I read that and I thought that was interesting. There was another one, but it was using bonds instead of heat transfer. So like as long as it has like an ionic or covalent bond between all the molecules, then like, oh, you know, you're good. That's an object like that. So I read stuff like that, and I thought it was kind of like interesting, but kind of ad hoc, if I'm being honest. So that's kind of how I think about bundle theory too, like kind of ad hoc, like,
Gotcha.
like like it's attractive to me in the sense that like I want to hold on to, like I don't want to be so uncomfortable with my like rejection of all these different things, and bundle theory seems like a way for me to like try to hold on to it, but it kind of just seems ad hoc, and it kind of just seems like it's like no, like I should either like commit to this thing or don't commit to it. But like, I don't know, bundle theory almost seems like a halfway measure to me. I don't know.
Yeah, because I know somebody who's a bundle theorist, and I sort of talked to him a little bit about this. It seems to me that bundle theory almost commits you to like having to reject that there are any synthetic truths at all, because like if the way that we describe a substance is based upon like all the bundle of properties that it has, it seems like whenever we say something like the apple is red, what is there within the definition of the subject of that sentence, the apple, is going to include redness within it. Seems like then you're saying this red apple is red, which is an analytic truth.
Yeah.
So it seems like, is there a way that a bundle theorist could even like endorse, no, I know some synthetic truths are not, given that like it seems like every commitment of theirs is itself going to be analytic, at least if they're defining a substance or a subject of a sentence by the attributes it has. And it seems like not at all,
Yeah.
which seems kind of awkward. Like, how do we learn things if like everything we know a priori or analytically? So I don't know. I'll have to talk to my friend more just to see how he might answer that, because he might not be too committed to bundle theory anyways. So
okay, yeah. And it's something that I should probably read more about before I kind of make some kind of overarching statement where I say like it seems ad hoc to me. Frankly, I'm just not.
Yeah. Well, if I was gonna give you a recommendation, read more epistemology. It seems like that's gonna definitely clear up a lot of things. Like start reading Michael Huemer maybe, or something like that, because like it seems to me that like your whole approach to philosophy is like kind of backwards in a lot of ways. Like I feel you got to read Descartes, his first Meditations, and get through that, and like then talk to me. I'm just kidding.
You can't talk to me unless you've no. I think you're kind of right. And I think you're right for a couple of reasons. I guess number one, it's like I have no formal training in philosophy. So, and like half the reason I started this YouTube channel was to have conversations exactly like this one, where I am out of my depth, and it's going to challenge me on like, I didn't start this YouTube channel to like deconvert Catholics because Catholics suck. And I'm not Matt Dillahunty. I'm not, I started this channel for one reason. It's to hold this guy accountable for what he believes. And that's it. That's the only reason. And so I'm not like actually trained in philosophy. So there's that, and that's a big piece of it. But then the other thing too is that I think that in some ways my engineering degree like works against my ability to learn philosophy because I'm so empirically minded. Like like I read this philosophy stuff, and like if none of it is empirical, I'm kind of like, all right, like nope, I can't know any of this unless it's empirical. So like let's go to the empirical and then work our way backwards rather than like which is kind of the opposite of philosophy, right? Philosophy kind of starts with like, hey, what can I know? And then work my way out, while like empiricism is like the opposite. It's like, no, we're going to start with the empirical and work our way back in. So it is backwards.
Right.
So not only am I not educated in philosophy, but I'm also educated in engineering, which is like the opposite of what, philosophy is. So, you know, I've got those two things working against me. But luckily I started this channel so that I can have conversations like the one that we just did, so I can actually like challenge myself. And you know, I'm reading books like Josh Rasmussen's Who Are You Really, specifically to challenge myself. You know what I mean? Because if I only ever listened to Matt Dillahunty and Aaron Raw, I'm never gonna learn anything new. You know what I mean? I'm just gonna, you know, kind of tribalistic and, you know, all that stuff. So that's why I'm here, and that's why I'm so grateful to you for having this conversation with me.
Yeah. No, it was a lot of fun. I'm really glad we were able to get to it, and I had a lot of fun, and just like I really appreciate and love watching your channel, because you're somebody who likes to explore with ideas and like update your reasoning and interact with people that disagree with you, and also lay out arguments of your own just to sort of like get interaction from people. I really dig that, and like definitely an attitude that I want to cultivate in myself as well. So yeah, it's been great.
And I'm just giving Spartan Theology the thumbs up too. So he's echoing your point that epistemology is the best place to start. So cool. I'll pick up some humor. Right after I'm done with Rasmussen, I'll pick up some humor and take it from there.
Yeah, sounds good.
Cool. John, thank you so much. This was a blast, and let's do it again sometime.
Yeah, would be fun.